Command General Staff College join us for this webinar. So he's going to present for an hour or so, hour and a half or so. And then when he's done, we'll have a Q&A portion. For all questions, I would just ask that you put those in text format into the chat, and then I will read them out loud. So with that in mind, if you could keep your mics muted, and preferably, especially with the crowd this large, your cameras off as well, just to preserve bandwidth, that would be great. So with that, I turn it over to you, James.
All right, thank you. So welcome to Using Commercial War Games in Professional Military Education. One of the things that changed my slideshow came out yesterday. We've just gotten in some Joint Chiefs vision for professional military education. There's a link down at the bottom of the slide, which has stated that curricula should leverage live virtual constructive and gaming methodologies with war games and exercises involving multiple sets and reps to develop deeper insight and ingenuity. So this, of course, is music to my ears, and I thought I would put that up front. One of the things that this might wind up with us going back to take another look at is the ways that we were teaching at places like the Naval War College in the 1920s and 1930s, when the curriculum was quite literally structured around the wargaming. If they weren't wargaming in a given week, it was unusual, and most weeks they were wargaming 3 days a week. Will we get that far at CGSC? I don't know. It's not really up to me, but should we go that way, then my shop is prepared to support it. So where we're going, now we're back to the planned remarks, if you will. Where we're going on this talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about background, a bit about what commercial wargaming and PME actually mean, go over quickly what the use cases for wargames are in PME as I see them, go into some detail on how we make the selection of that, which is a model that we call PDI. Talk about some examples. I'm going to show on the slides more names of examples than I'm intending to talk, in part because otherwise this talk would go on for hours and hours and hours. However, some of them may be things that you will then want to pick at and say, hey, tell me more about X in the questions. And last but not least, I'll mention a few tips that we've learned over the past decade and a half about how to teach and run these games in the classroom. By the way, down at the bottom of this, you can see us running a game of Thunder in the East for some students in the classroom. In the lower right, you can see Mike Dunn, the guy with the gray hair and the glasses facing away from the camera. Mike Dunn is my co-teacher, and you'll often hear me refer to him, so I figured it would be good to have a picture of him up front. And very much the classes we run are generally the Mike and James show. My background, I'm a historian by training. I've been a gamer since about 1977. I began designing in 1978 when I was in the 4th grade. The games, if you're lucky, will never see the light of day, but apparently that urge was in there for a long time. I got hired on to work at CGSC in 2004. We are part of Army University, which includes the Command and General Staff College. In particular, we are the Simulation Education Division in the Directorate of Simulation Education, which for some of you who have been around longer will know that as the Digital Leader Development Center until it got sort of strangely ripped apart. And there are two different things that we wind up doing. One, we support the educational use of war games and simulation across the Command and General Staff College, across Army University. And second, we teach the use of war games and simulations and the design of war games in classes that are there. I have a cat nosing at me. The students that we interact with most are CGSC students. That means they're majors, senior captains. These days, generally when they arrive, they're captains promotable, and they will pin on while they are in the course, who are attending what's known as intermediate level education. They've got about 10 years of time in service. By this point, they've basically made the decision that they are going to be professional officers. They are going to be in for a full 20 years of service. Most of the students at CGSC are U.S. Army. However, the students are carved up into sets of 16 for most of the class year. In each of those groups of 16, we will have one Air Force officer. We'll have one Sea Service officer, either Navy or Marine Corps. We'll have occasionally a small number of Coast Guard, and we will have a small minority of other sister services, other government agencies. So we'll get people from State Department. We'll have people from the Border Patrol. We've had students in from the Agriculture Department on occasion. In addition, 1 in 16 students at the Command and General Staff College is an international officer from almost anywhere in the world. I've never seen a student from North Korea, but I've seen Chinese, we've seen Russians, I've never seen an Iranian, seen pretty much anywhere else you care to name. As a result of which, the Command and General Staff College very much operates on an unclassified level, which I have no problem with. I'm in fact perfectly happy with that. One of our particular focuses is that we are responsible for the education on simulations of the functional area of 57 U.S. Army officers. That's the simulation operations career field. So these are people who, in the mid-late time as captains, normally have decided to leave their original branch and become specialists in simulations and running and planning exercises. We also support schools such as SAMS, SCP, WINSEC. SAMS is the source of the Jedi Knights who planned the invasion of Iraq in '91. School of Command Prep is a school for people who are about to be in either battalion or brigade command. WINSEC, the Western Hemisphere Institute of Security Cooperation, used to be known as the School of the Americas. Is taught down at Fort Benning, and to my surprise, something I'd really not known before we wound up supporting them about 10 years ago, about 3/4 of the students are US, because that means that as the primarily Latin and South American students come in from overseas, they wind up meeting with a lot of the US officers. The primary courses that we teach, and everything in here one way or another is a choice for students with some exceptions. So the FA-57s are required to take the first 3 things listed here: training with simulations, exercise design, fundamentals of wargame design. Students who are going to be the white cell for their section exercises take Alpha 388 during the school year. Alpha 681 is a course that we teach in combination with the history faculty, in which we teach history through wargaming. And students have the option of signing up for the focus track of wargame design inside the Masters of Military Arts and Sciences program. We run that track. We get in about 8 to 10 students a year that we accept into the program, and they have to design a wargame on a topic of their choice and also write it up in the thesis. Students routinely tell us that it is both the hardest and the best way to get your MMAS. We also run a brown bag gaming program that I will talk about later, and we support numerous other classes and courses where the instructors request the support. So let's think about commercial wargaming for a minute. Commercial is kind of a large term because there's a broad gray area between pure COTS, pure commercial, hey, I bought it in the store, I bought it on Steam, and pure GOTS, where there is a program of record and a congressionally approved funding line that directs it, at which point, frankly, it is a massive battleship of a program. Because there are programs out there, games out there that are used by both sides. There are games out there that were produced either by the DoD or by the commercial side that then get modified for use on the other side. There are things that were built for the DoD and then wind up being sold commercially. There are things that are built by the DoD but with strong commercial sensibilities, even though they never really hit the open market. And there are the pure DoD program of record sims. In a very real sense, the dividing line between this, what is and is not in this talk, is just before the last one. I'm not going to talk about the program of record sims, but anything above that, to my mind, is more or less fair game. I take a big tent approach to what it means to being a war game. I know that people can get into big fights over this, and some people will say, oh, it must have hexes and counters, or the computer games don't count, or. From my perspective, if it is a game and it in one way or another involves the military, then it sounds to me like a war game, and I don't get particularly persnickety after that. So, for example, one of our students, a star student of ours in the master's program a couple years ago, did a game on how you prepare and then deploy and then operate a Army field hospital. There's no direct combat in it, but from my perspective, there's a very military component, and it counted as a war game. Simulations versus games, you will hear me use those two terms somewhat interchangeably, and there is, in effect, a weaponized reason for this. There's a tendency for people who haven't thought about the definitions to say, well, games are for fun, and therefore they're not serious, and simulations are for serious purposes, so sim good, game bad, which does not work very well as a definition, since you can use the same thing, and depending on how you label it, in different purposes, off you go. I have a tendency to fall back to the Army's definition that a simulation is a model iterated over time. And when you add decisions and goals to a simulation, it is a game. That means that, of course, all of our various exercises are games. People are making decisions in pursuit of a goal, and there are simulations underlying them. However, by using the terms interchangeably, I'm trying to legitimize the term game and make it no longer a bad word for people. There's a split in the purpose for which we use games and simulations. Wargaming for analysis, we're asking a question about reality, and we're trying to get an answer back. As a result of which, these tend to have a much more stringent, much more numbers-based verification process, validation process, to make sure that you're getting a number, an outcome that is correct. And they are correct to be doing that. However, when we are doing this for training and education, the real question is, are the students learning what we need them to? Which means that we can often assert things about reality because they wind up supporting whatever it is we think we need to do. So for example, we could be doing a wargame for analysis in which we're going to figure out how it is that a missile flies away from the aircraft. And we're going to simulate in great detail how the missile leaves the aircraft and what speed it's going at, and how it flies through the slipstream, because we want to know whether or not, as it leaves the slipstream around the aircraft, it gets destabilized. So when we're pulling, say, 5G at 0.75 Mach, will it be destabilized? We want to know before we put a pilot in the aircraft and try and launch this thing at potential loss of life and limb. However, when we're going to be doing the missile launch for training, now I'm going to simply tell the sim, hey, in these conditions, the missile can launch and track correctly, full stop. In those conditions, it cannot launch and track correctly, because the question I'm asking is not, when does it launch and track? The question I'm asking is, can the trainee pilot put the simulated aircraft into the correct envelope to launch the missile? And we're not going to spend the effort to simulate how the missile leaves unless that is of particular importance, which given the question is probably not. So for the talk today, we're really looking at the training and education side. And honestly, given where I've worked for the past 15 years, it's really on the education side. And last but not least, taking a look at wargames and PME. PME is professional military education. So there's things that we do in teaching using the games. And some of them are, we are directly teaching tactics, operations, strategy, similar things, because the topic of the game is the thing we're trying to teach. We're not indirectly teaching it. We're not teaching something around the edge. And then there's times when we are using the game, but the actual topic of the game isn't the thing we're really driving at. We're trying to get at a thought process or an understanding or an awareness, and the game is going to help us get there, but the actual topic of the game, we don't care so much about. And there's teaching history, which in some cases is really a special case of indirectly teaching. Because while we teach a fair amount of military history in professional military education, we aren't teaching the history for itself. In many ways, we are going back to a comment by J.F.C. Fuller in one of his books many years ago, let us now be clairvoyant as regards the future. For without this, the history of war is but bloody romance. We're trying to teach people the lessons of the past to make them better leaders for the future. So while we want them to learn how things worked at the Somme or at the Battle of Waterloo or whatever it might be, we're wanting them to learn this so that they can apply those lessons and be successful commanders. We are also teaching the art and to some degree the science of wargaming, how to use wargames and how to design wargames. Last but not least, there's individual professional development, which for some people could be, hey, they're going to go off and they're going to practice at a rifle range, or they're going to practice other outdoor skills. But another way to do that is to play war games and practice your decision making. So I will at some point talk about all of these as we go through this. And I think this was one of the places that we were thinking to stop for questions, if you wanted to do that, Robert. Or would you like me to drive on?
Certainly, we have a couple questions here we could address. So first question we have is someone asking, as part of the DEU medical service, I am highly interested in the mechanisms of the field hospital game that you previously referred to.
Excellent, and please get in contact. Please get in contact with me later, and I can put you in touch with the student who designed it. That's Major Caitlin Ebbets. I don't know if you know her anyway already.
So second question here is, and I'll coordinate in the background here, getting that contact information. James, do you have a preference for computer-based versus tabletop games for teaching critical thinking?
So I'm going to touch on that later in more detail, but the short answer is I think there are strengths and weaknesses to both. And in many cases, the strength of one is the weakness of the other. They sort of, you know, where one gets better, the other gets worse, and where one gets worse, the other gets better. I'm not inherently predisposed to say that one is automatically the best solution.
All right, so thus far that, oh, here we go, one last one.
All right.
What are good games to start on? The last session recommended books, the Richthofen's War or Guns at Gettysburg good, or Junior Officers is more visual better?
I will also touch on some of our favorite introductory games. I just saw the Cots and Gots thing pop up, so I'll hit that as well.
Yeah, go for it.
In fact, I'm going to just move back to the slide that mentioned it in the lower right. So introductory war games, of those two in particular, Richthofen's War is simple. Personally, I would tend to call it relatively simplistic, but the thing we've done, a concept that Mike came up with as a air warfare game, we started using Wings of War in one of our courses, and I will talk about that example specifically in the future. Guns of Gettysburg we think is brilliant. We also thought that it was hard to get our heads around, which is very unfair to the game because it uses a lot of concepts that are new to us the same way that new games are new to everybody who's new to wargaming. So poor us, we were forced to be learning the game from scratch again, and that was a problem. On the other hand, I think Simmons does a great job with the designs. And one of the things we loved about Guns of Gettysburg is that because of the way that it breaks up the reinforcement schedule, instead of fighting the Battle of Gettysburg, where all of us know the dance steps and who's going to show up when, you wind up fighting a battle at Gettysburg, which is what the historical commanders did. And so for all of that, our game went completely haywire in terms of recreating history. It was nonetheless, in some ways, a much better job of being put into the shoes of the historical commanders because they didn't know what the order of arrival was either. They didn't know where the battle lines were fated to draw out and what fights were going to occur. I hope I covered the Cots and Gots definition by moving back to that slide. So I'm going to drive on a little bit. So PDI, Purpose Decisions Interactions, is both our selection methodology and also, when we use it that way, it's our analytic map. Purpose is, what do you want the students to learn? Decisions and dilemmas, what do they need to wrestle with in order to get at that purpose? And interactions are, what does the game have to do to present those dilemmas so that we get at the purpose? Because in the end, if we can't get at the learning purpose, we are wasting our time. So an instructor comes to us and says, I would like a game in this class. And our question back is always, okay, what's the point? What do you want the students to learn? Also, what are the constraints? How much time do we have? Because time, unfortunately, is always at an extraordinary premium. A rule of thumb I tend to use is that if you're going to give me a block of time, I can use no more than 10% of that on teaching the students the game. And that is a horrific statistic from both sides. Because from the instructor's perspective, I'm going to take 10% of your class away and waste it on teaching the game, not the key learning activity, not the things you want to get at. However, equally, from the teaching the game perspective, that means that in a 2-hour class, I have, at best, 12 minutes to teach the game, which is also a pretty tall order. So we have a strong preference in the end for games that are simple, hopefully without being simplistic. Constraints also are things like, how many students do we have? How many rooms do we have? How much table space do we have? How many computers? If we're using computers, we've got to work through all of that and figure out how we're going to run this event so that it is functional. One of the other things that we are keenly aware of is, where does this fit inside the instructor's lesson plan? At CGSC, the Army carefully teaches all the instructors to build their lesson plans in accordance with Kolb's experiential learning model. And while it seems a little odd at first, I've found over the years that this is a useful way of approaching thinking about what you're going to do in the class. The assumption is you begin with a concrete experience, something which is going to get the students interested, which is why sometimes you've seen people begin their lectures with a film clip or a joke or whatever, trying to get you to feel something about it. If it is effective, you're going to be unable to avoid having what CGSC calls publish and process, because reasons the Army uses different terms from the ones that Kolb uses, and I'm used to the Army's terms, so I will wind up referring to them that way. People are going to talk about it. You're going to do whatever the initial experience thing is, and they will be sharing with each other what occurred. What you want to have happening in there is, hopefully you've controlled it enough that it's sort of one at a time and they're sharing with the entire group, that you've got themes coming out in that you've got items coming up in it that you can harness during the generalized new information, during the process of the primary learning loop of the class. In a discussion class, you often wind up shifting back and forth between the publish and process and the GNI. People will bring things up, then they'll come back to what happened in the concrete experience, and back and forth and back and forth. And at some point in all of this, you have some kind of an apply. Show that you can use what you've learned. And that apply may well be the concrete experience for another loop around. It is entirely possible that you will have the apply peanut buttered out across multiple stages of the course as you say, okay, I'm going to expect you to apply, either you tell the students directly or not, I expect you to apply what you've learned today during the C tomorrow, during the discussion tomorrow, and watch that build up. We certainly do that in the training with simulations course, where much of the course is spent with concrete experiences taking up half the day of play a given game. And then we get them to reflect on what they just did in playing it and start talking about, as the standard thing, questions for each class. What could this teach? What can't it teach? What could something else of this kind teach? And each of the games we put in that class also illustrates something else that we want to discuss. But we expect that they're going to get better and better at teasing out what is or is not good about each of those as we go through the course. So that part of the apply is, hey, you're doing better than you did yesterday, than the day before, than the week before, as you go through the discussion. Of these 4 steps, to my mind, you can put a game into 3 of them. You can have the game as a concrete experience. It's often significantly longer than the standard concrete experience, because games will take longer to execute through. But they also can be remarkably effective at getting the students to think about the problem that you want them to think about. It's fairly obvious how you use them in apply. You put them in as the experiential test at the end of the course and watch and see if the students can do the things that they're supposed to be able to do. They're able to work through whatever it is they're supposed to work through. You can also put it in the GNI stage, and this is true learning through experimentation. I set you a series of problems. You work at them until you solve them. You learn from your failures. You work back and around and around. This is an extraordinarily powerful means of learning. A tale I always tell at this point is, my brother is alive because of a computer game. Back in the early 1990s, there's a game put out called Life and Death. It was a surgery simulation for abdominal surgery. And you would get a series of patients who had some kind of abdominal pain, which I don't remember all of the things it could be, but it could be constipation, it could be gas, it could be cramps, it could be appendicitis, it could be a aortal ballooning out of your aorta. And you had to figure out what they had, and then if an operation was called for, then you would perform the operation. Of course, if you wanted to keep on practicing the operation, then you had the option of performing the operation when it wasn't called for, not that we would ever have done that more than 3 or 4 or 5 times. And it was extraordinarily painstaking about being accurate. It insisted that you did the right steps at the right time with the right tools. It would check to see if you left tools inside the patient, guilty. It would make sure that you drew the incisions straight enough with the mouse, which we found meant you had to hold up a ruler to the mouse to make the incision sufficiently straight. And it was painstakingly accurate about the symptoms. So over the course of about 6 to 8 weeks, we both went through this, and eventually we had finally succeeded. We had done the operation successfully, and we put it away, and we went on to other things. Fast forward 5 or 6 years, my brother had become a farmer, and he had discovered that painkillers didn't really work very well on him, and he didn't like going to doctors anyway. So his typical response to anything unpleasant going on in his body was, sleep it off and think twice about calling the doctor in the morning. But when he got a sharp stabbing pain in the lower right-hand quadrant of his abdomen, halfway between the hip bone and the pubic bone and nowhere else, he said, wait a sec, I know what this means. I need to go to the hospital. So he got himself taken to the hospital. The surgeon operated on him, removed his appendix, and said that it was the most inflamed appendix he had seen in 20 years without it bursting. So if my brother had put it off, he would be dead. So in the end, this is a win, right? I still have a brother. I think that's great. On the other hand, if we are colder about this, we can also look at this and ask whether or not it was necessary to spend 6 weeks of free time to learn that lesson. The downside of using games in GNI is that while they're effective and the lessons are driven very deep, it takes a lot of time. The reason that we wind up using lectures, sock puppeting away like I'm doing now, is because it is time efficient. We also know, unfortunately, that it is learning largely ineffective. Most of you will have forgotten 90 to 95% of what I say today before you leave. Admittedly, with the recording, you can go back, you can look at it again, that will help. But for all that, I'm happy to be doing this, and I hope you are happy being here, we know this isn't the best way to learn. So games will help, but you have to think very, very carefully about where you're going to put them and what lessons it is you want to teach so that you really hit the key lessons. Whereas if you jabber about something on and on, then you can work through a lot of points and claim that you have covered them, even if the students have not really understood them all that well. I don't see any particular way to put it into publish and process, because publish and process is inherently talking about what happens in the concrete experience. And if you wind up doing something else, you have some other active experimentation in one way or another, then you are in some other section of the class already. All right, we're going to keep going. The decisions and dilemmas are key. You need to talk with the faculty, the instructor, and find out what it is that's going to help them either cause the students to come to the realizations they need for the concrete experience or for the GNI, or is going to show that they've learned things for the apply. This can take a fair amount of discussion, and it can also, while you're doing it, it can really help you trim down what it is that the game needs to do. So many, many years ago, we had a faculty member come in and say, hey, okay, we want to run a simulation in which we have the students plan an air assault, they'll land, they'll march over land, they'll assault the objective, and that's what we want them to do. And we had to simulate the whole thing. So we started asking them, all right, we can't actually simulate all of that very smoothly in anything we had at the time. Is there anything that's going to go wrong during loading the troops into the helicopters? No. Is there anything that's going to go wrong while they're flying to the LZ? No. Is there anything that's going to go wrong while they're unloading at the LZ? No. Is there anything that's going to go wrong while they're in the approach march from the LZ to the objective? Yes. And so we said, well, given that there's no decisions they're going to have to make in the sim, why don't we start with them departing from the LZ? Have them plan the load, have them plan how they're going to do the transit into all the air load planning stuff, all the flight route planning, but then say, hand wave at the beginning of the exercise, all of that worked. Let's cut to the chase where the decisions are. And it helps focus in on what's really important, what's really key for what they want to happen in the actively wargamed portion of the exercise. You can then really draw a line between the decisions and dilemmas stage and the interactions, because often the faculty we have coming to us are not specialized in simulations, war games. They're not gamers at home. They know what they want, but they don't know what they want to have supporting it. So we then run off and we try to find something that will provide the interactions that either force or create the opportunity for the decisions and dilemmas they need. Because fundamentally what any game is going to do is present a set of information. The players decide what they're going to do with it, and within the affordances that the game offers, they put in a set of orders. And then the game runs forward using the players' orders, AI orders, whatever the source of all the decisions are, runs the model forward and produces a new set of a new situation. And it presents that to the players. And if it's a first-person shooter, this could be happening at the sub-second level, crunching through. If it's a really detailed wargame, then it could be that this is happening on a scale of hours while they ponder through what the next move is going to be. But nonetheless, in each case, it's important in structuring what they're going to make the decisions about. What information do they need? What decisions can they put into the system? And what comes back out at them. So we go and we find things that we think will get at what the instructor needs, and then we show them to the instructor. We say, hey, here's 3, 4, however many options we find. These are the things we found. These are what we see as the strengths and weaknesses for your purpose. And we ask them, please sit down and play with these. Try them. Look them over. Push the pieces around. Grab the mouse. Do whatever. And see whether or not it looks to you like, in practice, this is going to get at the things that you want to get at. And if they say, well, yes, we want this one. Cool. All right. What day are we running this? Let's figure out the deeper details of how this is going to be structured. Or possibly they look at all of them and they say, nope, none of these are good enough, at which point we say, all right, why? Try to understand the requirement better and go off to either find something that suits, or we might have to make something, or potentially to try and contract out for something, which is admittedly the absolute rarest of the solutions because it's an extremely difficult hurdle to overcome. The other way to look at this, and I'll only cover this a bit more briefly so that we drive on a bit, is this is also an analytic map when you're looking at a game for potential classroom use. So we'll look at them and say, okay, what are the interactions this has? What's the information it provides? What can you put in? What can you get out of it? What dilemmas does it really pose to you? What are the problems it poses? And therefore, what purposes might it serve? So if we're looking at a squad level game, we can immediately rule it out for national strategy. It's an obvious mismatch. And while that's a fairly blunt way to look at it, the blunt example, there are far more fine-grained examples where we look at something and say, this is at the right echelon, but it doesn't really get at the right dilemmas. We want logistics, but this is focused on maneuver or whatever it might be. So I believe that this is almost the right place to, we'll get another round of questions after this slide. So how do we know whether or not we made the right choice? And this is a question we get fairly often. And our answer fundamentally is ask the instructor. The instructor understands their class best. And this sometimes gets up people's noses when they're saying, well, we want the social sciences in here and we want to do lots of statistical study and numbers and this, that, and the other. But fundamentally, it's the instructor who understands and knows whether or not this was a good trade-off in time for the other things they could have been doing in the course in order to drive the learning. It's also often the case that for us in Sims, when we're supporting somebody else, we do not get to see the payoff. We come in, we help run the game, we leave, and then the instructor says, that was wonderful. For the next 3 weeks, they were referring back to it in the course. It's great, I want to do it again. We're saying, cool, we couldn't tell that at the time. We're glad you want to do it again. It's great that it worked. When do you want it to happen? And in many ways, the simplest measure of was this good enough is that the instructor asks for it to happen again. When it's in our classes, Mike Dunn and I are continuously running AARs. We have an AAR of hot wash AAR after every class. Did this work? Did this game really work out? Was it as good as it should have been? Did it get at the learning that we were hoping? There's endless discussion at the end of each of the courses along all the same lines. Did all of these games pull their weight? And any game that's not pulling its weight is in danger of being ejected from the course and replaced with another. We tend to refer to those as cage matches because it's one game, 2 games enter, 1 game leaves. And there's at least 1 cage match every time we rethink the course, which we're doing fairly frequently. Keep in mind, as George Box has told us all models are wrong, but some are useful. There will be something wrong with every single game you use. None of them are perfect. We use the games in the end because they are not realistic. If we really wanted realistic training, we would give both sides at the live training centers live ammunition and tell them to have at it. The survivors would learn a lot. Recruiting command would have a problem. But in the end, we use simulation because we want to avoid the costs in time and or money and or blood of doing something for real. We can't afford to put a full division in the field and have it run a combat training center exercise. It's too expensive. It's hugely expensive to run that for brigades at a time, although it's also very valuable. By the same measure, when you've got a limited amount of time, you've got to decide what you're going to leave in and what you're going to leave out. And you've got to try and make sure that what you are leaving out is still the piece that is of value. The George Box quote goes on, the practical question is how wrong can they be and still be useful? And that's very much the question that I find we have to ask. You're always having to work through the trade-offs. You want this level of detail in the game, but it means it's going to be harder to teach. It will take longer to run. Maybe the students need to be in either smaller groups or we need more facilitators. Or in order to get through the game in the time that we have available, we are going to break something about the setup so that it is possibly ahistorical, or possibly it is a strange setup in some means to force a given trade-off to occur. Maybe we're going to hand wave something that otherwise is very important in order to make sure we focus on what we need. But you've always got to be thinking those things through and trying to make sure it doesn't break what's important, which is what the instructor wants to teach. All right, Robert, do we have questions we should hit now, or should we drive on to the next section?
Yeah, we've got a nice batch of questions here that we can get through.
All right.
So first is a more general question. Do you think wargaming should be required in professional military education?
So my personal mission in my job, and this is sort of the aiming high, and if I had all of my druthers, my personal mission is that games should be used in every class, every day, across Army education, and the game that is available for every class every day is so good that every instructor wants it in the class. I freely admit I don't expect to achieve that by the time that I retire, the earliest date for which, assuming all goes well, is 2034, so I got a while in yet. It's a hard road to travel because in the end, there is no one size fits all for education. Very much every different course is a different requirement. And in many ways, every day of every course is a different requirement because you've got a different learning objective day after day after day. So it takes a great deal of work to do. But that is my aim point. I am a true believer in the value of wargaming for education. If you were hoping that somehow I would be anything else, then you are going to leave disappointed because as far as I'm concerned, it's a great way to teach. It's not always an easy way to teach.
And so following up on that, in reference to the curriculum at CGSC that you were talking about earlier, are electives enough to expand upon wargaming, or should the curriculum of record be expanded? Once learned, how can this tool be expanded upon throughout a career?
I would love to have more wargaming in the curriculum. I do not control anything except the electives that Mike or I are teaching. And if I ruled the world, then the world would be a different place. But equally, I don't. There's a large level at which I treat this. We're going to skip ahead now because I was going to hit this at the end. There's a large level at which I treat this as an insurgency. We look for opportunities and we exploit them. And a guy named Bill Haggart taught me a model called SPISH many, many years ago. SPISH stands for Scouts, Pioneers, Settlers, and Hermits. And scouts are perhaps 5% of your population, and they're the magpies. They want something new. Is it new? Is it fresh? Is it shiny? We like it. Yay! And they're always looking for things. They will self-identify to me because they're hoping that I have something new and shiny and exciting for them. And I like talking to the scouts because they often have neat, shiny, new ideas that they will share with me, and therefore I will learn from them. And there's an instructor we work with at CGSC who is the quintessential scout. And as we often say of him, he does not get mugged by the good idea fairy. He takes the good idea fairy out to candlelit dinners hoping to get lucky. And often he's getting lucky. Talking to him is amazing. He's got this fountain of ideas coming off him, a new idea every couple minutes. And they're often really cool. On the other hand, nailing him to the wall long enough to execute on one of them can sometimes be a challenge. But quite frankly, just the fact that I learned some of these ideas when he comes by and talks to me or sends me an email, I'm perfectly happy to have his input and hear what he has to say. The second group, the pioneers, they're the ones who are looking at the bright, shiny objects that the scouts have found, and they're asking, hey, how do we really make this work? And they want to make it work. It has to work for them to make use of it. So they will put in the hard work to figure out, how does this really fit in curriculum? How do we demonstrate that this actually suits what we're trying to teach? And when I find a pioneer, I will support the pioneer to the hilt. I want the pioneer to look like a hero. I want the pioneer to demonstrate that, yes, this game they've discovered really does work. Because when they've got it figured out and they've encapsulated it in a lesson plan, the settlers, who are the vast majority of your population, will say, oh, okay, I have the lesson plan in front of me. This is how it's executed. It's codified. They got the PowerPoints to teach it or whatever it is that they need as support, and they will execute. And now we're going mainstream with whatever it is. It's worth keeping in mind that most people turn out to be scouts for some topic and settlers, pioneers for another topic, and settlers for most. It's not that everybody is one thing for one thing, but I'm worried about how they are in relation to wargaming in the classroom. Last but not least, you've got the hermits, whom originally, after Bill had taught me this, I titled the haters and said, well, you don't talk to them. But as I was relating to Bill Haggart how I was using this model of his, he said, no, you shouldn't ignore them, because often the hermits are the people who are prior scouts and pioneers who are burned out from their battles with bureaucracy and prior failures and so on and so forth. And therefore, you should listen to them in order to understand where the pitfalls are so that hopefully you can avoid them. So that's our model in looking at the instructor population, if you will, in which we try to learn as best we can from the scouts, support the living heck out of the settlers so that we achieve victory by passing goodness and utility onto the settlers en masse, and thereby we lift the value of the education.
All right, so now we have a few questions concerning format. First,
Okay.
have you considered developing a common set of rules and methodologies so you don't have to relearn for each game? For instance, the British use the Camberley Kriegspiel rules. Canadians are now developing a similar approach for company to brigade-sized games.
The answer is yes and no. Mostly, I guess the answer is really mostly no. The problem is that any given set of rules tends to be only right for a given set of problems. And the set of problems we have to address turns out to be wide enough that a single set of rules does not work. An example that we run into a lot for Alpha 681, the History and Action elective, which is 8 3-hour sessions in which we play 8 different games covering 8 different periods of history. The selection criteria for that are: 1, we have to think it's a good game, and 2, one way or another, the game has to be available, and 3, we have to be able to teach and execute it inside of about 2.5 hours, leaving at least half an hour for discussion. This year, we're using about 45 minutes for discussion. And 4, it has to be positively dripping with both thematic and mechanical elements that are unique to its time period and what it's showing. I've been shown a number of game systems that people say, hey, it's simple, it's easy to learn, it'll work for 681. It treats everything from modern warfare back to the first thrown rock with the same system. And I'm left sitting there saying, yeah, but what does it really teach you is different about each period of history? How do you learn that perhaps the US Civil War is different from the American Revolution, is different from World War I, if in all of them you've the same rules, the same sets of combat factors, the same sequence of play? You're not emphasizing what's unique. So instead, for example, one of the games we're using with a slight degree of trepidation this time is Nevsky, which came out this past December. And it's a work of genius in showing medieval warfare at the operational low strategic level. It is something of a head twist for modern people to go in and realize that as soon as you levy your vassals, they're on a clock for when they're going home. That solving the problem of how do you feed these guys was a big problem back then as well, and so on and so forth. The worry we've got about Nevsky is that we're not yet sure how to teach it. So there's a real experiment there, but it's not something that I would be comfortable trying to. I wouldn't get the same lessons taught if I took, say, the standard Avalon Hill SPI kind of rules out of the 1970s, which are very simple by comparison, but they're not going to show what's unique about medieval warfare. It would be, okay, now I maneuver slightly different statistic units over a slightly different set of terrain, and we claim that it's Novgorod fighting the Teutonic Knights as opposed to some other war. So specifics in the system, to my mind, wind up being part of the teaching point.
Excellent. And similarly, or somewhat similarly, with the proliferation of personal digital devices, has CGSC considered a simulation or wargame app that could be used for professional development outside the classroom setting?
The short answer to that is mostly no. One of the things that we've built, we're kind of going through bits of the next slide. So a number of years ago, we built, and it's still in use by some of the history faculty, a game called The Grand Offensive. And it is ostensibly a single move game in which the player, the student, we introduces Haig, technically it's Rawlinson, planning day one at the Somme. It's based off a game called Attack on the Somme by Richard Simpkin from back in the 80s. Turned out that there was a unofficial bootleg version made on another system from his that some of the instructors had used in the 90s that they wanted rebuilt so that it worked on modern computers. We got back to Simpkin, got his permission, and rebuilt it basically from scratch for modern systems. So the catch in the game is you decide what you're going to do. You allocate your divisions, you allocate the tubes of artillery to various sectors of the front and the mines, and you choose from 8 to 10 different techniques. I don't remember exactly how many, and you click the launch the attack button, and it pops up with your results. How far did you get in each sector? How far back did the German doctrinal counterattack throw you? How many people did you lose overall? And it compares that in terms of people lost to the historical performance on July 1, 1916. It also gives you a lot of feedback on your various choices. So for example, you chose to attack at dawn. The Germans couldn't see you very well, but on the other hand, they weren't surprised at all because everybody does a stand to at dawn. Well, you know that when you were selecting it, you could have chosen to attack at night, or you could have chosen to attack at noon. Would it work better if you did that? And there's this big button there saying, try again. And you click it, and you try again, and you keep on trying permutations. Every time you do that, in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, there is a small and unobtrusive counter going up one by one by one, counting how many times you tried again. So the students have been told to take this home, do it as homework, and print out the results and bring it to class. They print out the results, they bring it to class, and the instructor typically will start asking, so John, not how many times did you attack, how far did you get, and how many people did you lose? And Joe and Jane and so on and so forth around the room, and eventually starts asking, how many times did you try? Oh, a couple. Looks at the page. You tried 25 times. I've been in the room while a student had to admit to trying 73 times, and the record is apparently over 300. And this is a key turning point in this concrete experience, because they then turn around and ask the students, all right, all of you tried many, many times at this. Why? Well, we wanted to win. All right, so why did Douglas Haig keep on battering his head against the Germans at the Somme? Oh, he wanted to win. So it's the same reason. And now instead of sitting there and saying, hey, those guys a century ago, they were just idiots, they didn't know anything, I would never make their mistakes. Suddenly they're in a place where they have made those mistakes. And instead of treating it as somebody else's problems they have nothing to learn from, you can watch the students' heads sort of turn around and say, okay, I have something to learn from these horrible disasters in World War I and why they were disasters and why it wasn't clear to people at the time what the solution was and what the solutions eventually were and how they learned them. And then the class rolls on. So we have attempted to turn that into this gets back to the original question, have we built an app? We tried to make that into an app, and the problem we ran into is that with the limited coding skills we've got, we couldn't manage to make that in a format that would fit the enormous myriad of devices that were out there. I don't fully understand the ins and outs of why this didn't work. My coding skills are in Fortran 77 and are 3 decades out of date, but it did not fly. So we've tried, but we, unfortunately, in that instance, we did not succeed.
And one final question in this batch. We have had some success using wargaming as a training aid for naval architects and engineers in the UK engaged in warship design. Were they learned to understand the effect of their choices in design on warship capability? Are you aware of similar games being conducted in the US?
For warship design, no. For force structure design, yes. For tank design, yes. So I'm going to brush over those two lightly. One of the great ideas from the guy who's the quintessential scout was, hey, we should do this tank design game. And often his baseline ideas you can express with what amounts to an Excel sheet on a whiteboard. People will allocate these resources out for various generalized characteristics for their tanks. And you know that in an unknown number of years, but somewhere in the next 10 years, you have to have a force that will defeat this Op4 force that have tanks of this supposed capability. So go. How are you going to build it? How fast do you have to have a given capability? Do you get a better capability if it's sooner or if it's later? In designing games alongside the students in the game design elective, I made a more playable version of that once. Still required a calculator to play it. It never got sort of fully fleshed out, but it was getting at that same concept. And I believe that in some of his electives, he does run that game or similar things as he's going. We also built a thing called Future Force, which is a case of a game built for the DoD that then got a commercial release. You can buy it from HPS Sims, that is built to be a concrete experience on force management. Force management is, how do we figure out what the Army should be in 20 years, and how do we go through the bureaucratic process of going through all of the planning and budgeting and so on and so forth to make that happen. It is typically the most hated piece of instruction at CGSC. It is dull. So what the instructors wanted was something that would get the students engaged in the problem early so that they would have a better idea of what's going on and they would hate the instruction less. And it's proven to be remarkably effective at that in the classes where it's used, which is not all of them. It is not required for better or worse. So in Future Force, you have blue fighting against orange, and you can have students on both sides, or you can have orange be an AI. And in 1 year turns, you decide, all right, where am I going to deploy my brigade combat teams of 6 different flavors, from heavy through engineers? And you deploy them to various areas of the world. It's simply 5 engagement areas, which could either be at peace, or they could be facing irregular warfare, or they could be facing a full-scale operation. You find out what happened in both of those, in all of those 5 areas, after both of you have made your secret allocations. And then, this is really the heart of the game, you decide how you're going to spend your budget. You decide, I'm going to rebuild the following units that need to be rebuilt. I'm going to invest in transportation out to the theater. I'm going to invest in improving the technology of my units. I'm going to buy more units. I'm going to invest in strategic tactical intel. I'm going to invest in counter intel. I'm going to save maybe a little bit of money for later. And you can go through up to 20 years of this, wrestling against the other side, trying to gain strategic advantage over them through manipulating your force structure and a strategy on how you're going to deploy. Keeping in mind that every single year, the challenge in each of those 5 areas can change. And while you've got a prediction on how it might change and probabilities on what it's likely to become if it does change, it can sometimes really throw you off by, the area that's perfectly likely to be in a peacetime has suddenly gone to an irregular conflict, and you are incorrectly postured for that. Do you have enough strategic lift to be able to reapportion your forces to deal with it? If not, you're suddenly going to take it in the chin on that area. That answer that question?
Certainly. And we actually just have one last question come in here that I feel is pretty interesting. Can you talk about peer competition in educational wargaming? What are the pros and cons? What role should winning have in an educational wargaming context? Or
Yeah.
let's see, one of the modification of the question in the chat just came up. I'd replace winning with, quote, telling your commander you can no longer accomplish your mission.
I'm going to stick for the moment with literally winning.
Yep.
Because a doctrine of Mike's and mine is that you should never let either side win or be obviously going to win. Why? Because as soon as one group wins, and we've seen this too many times, they say, wow, this experience was awesome. It was the best. And I am a genius and I have nothing to learn. And as soon as one side loses, they say, this was stupid and it was a waste of time. And I am checked out. I'm looking at Facebook. I'm gone. But if both sides still think they're in it with a chance, then one side's saying, I was going to do this to you. Oh, no, I was going to do that back if you did this. And the energy in the discussion is still enormous because both of them still think that they had a chance, but they're not convinced that they were sure they were going to win because they could see some threats. So whenever possible, we don't let a game go to the point where somebody wins. And we always recommend to the instructors that they do the same thing. Equally, there's a layer at which when you hit the point where one side is clearly won, if you run it out to the point where whatever the scenario is actually recognizes you have achieved the victory condition, you're fundamentally wasting time. Because most likely, learning has stopped at the point where everyone recognizes that one side has won. You've done what you need to do. The other side is just in it to see how long the crying lasts. Why do we need to spend this time? There are more productive things we could be doing with it. So we have a tendency to avoid getting to the win condition if we can manage it. That said, competition is great. Most military officers are type A personalities. When you tell them, you and everybody else in this room is all on the same side against the AI, most of the time the energy level drops because now it doesn't matter. Oh, well, we're just against the AI. If you tell them, hey, you 4, 6, 8, whatever, you're taking on those guys on the other side of the room, the trash talk begins almost immediately and the energy goes through the roof. We've had specific things we use, Steel Beasts we use in one of the classes because it's a super complex vehicle sim. And part of the side lesson is, hey, notice what happens when you have to deal with getting all the detail you could ask for. Typically the tankers love it and the other people say, holy crap, that was complex. But one of the things that we did at first with that is we would put everybody in co-op. So 16 students all on the same side. And people sort of lollygagged through it and the tactical thinking was pretty poor. Then we said, all right, it's going to be team M1 against team Leopard. And now every single time, both teams are in it to win it. And the trash talk is running back and forth. And there's a lot more energy and attention paid. So competition, absolutely. It's a great thing. And this also goes to, people will ask, is the purpose of these to be fun? And the answer is no, the purpose is not fun. The purpose is learning. But fun is a great hook. Fun is an awesome hook to make people want to learn. One of the things we know is that if people want to learn something, it's hard to prevent them from doing it. If people are being forced to learn something, you must learn this for the test, then you can beat on them about the test and they will cram and they will regurgitate whatever you told them to say for the test and then they will flush it. So if you can use fun as the hook, and this is part of the power of using games in class, then you get people to want to learn it and off we drive.
Excellent. At this point, James, feel free to push on.
All right. So some examples of teaching directly. And we've talked about Future Force already, so I'm not going to discuss that one. So an example of direct teaching, we've got an instructor who likes to use Combat Mission Shock Force in order to teach combined arms tactics. It's exactly what Combat Mission Shock Force shows. We load it up on the computers in our laboratory. He brings them down 16 at a time. They face off either in teams against each other or in teams against the AI. I know I said that doesn't always work as well, but he makes it work for his class. And it does exactly what he's looking for. So it's direct instruction on what they want. Another example of that, Aftershock for disaster relief, defense support to civil authorities. We used, in fact, earlier today to support a DSCA class, Defense Support to Civil Authorities class, because the instructor wanted to have a exercise in the middle of the course in which they went from talking about, here are the legalities of when you can and can't be engaged, this is what you can and can't do under federal law, so on and so forth, these are the capabilities you do and don't have, to, all right, hey, let's remember that there's some reality to this, let's go in and run one of these operations, and then leverage that in discussion through the rest of the course. So we've been using that for that guy's course for a couple of years. We have a beta version of a Vassal module that one of my guys built over the past 4 weeks in order to make that happen. And at some point, once we've ironed a few more of the issues out of it, that should come out and you'll be able to download it from the Vassal site. Decisive Action is an example of a game that was essentially built in-house at DoD and then became a commercially available game as well. Decisive Action was originally written and created by a CGSC instructor. So in the most literal possible sense, it was built for CGSC instruction. When he retired out of the Army and went off to be a game designer, Jim Lunsford took with him the rights. He got permission from the Army to continue to own Decisive Action. And a couple of years later, the Army turned around and said, hey, could you perform the following improvements? And for a number of years, we were contracting to him to perform yearly upgrades to the software. The Fluvius Bellum and Land Power are a board game. You're actually seeing an early version of Land Power that is used at CGSC. It was developed by instructors. Fluvius Bellum is actually a separate title developed by Chris Carnes out at the Fort Belvoir campus, and both of these cover division level modern combat. There's an early version of Land Power that is up on Board Game Geek, Land Power GAT, and I need to get around to putting up the newer version of Land Power 7.1, which is massively changed into Board Game Geek as well, since I've managed to get the public release authority for it. It will not come with the map because the map is limited distribution and I can't put that out. Follow Me is a game that was built for West Point. Is not available commercially, but is really an example of a commercial design aesthetic. It's very much, in many ways, like a less graphically intense version of Close Combat. The player needs to be commanding a platoon. You get 3 squads, you get 2 machine guns. It's right-click for a context-sensitive menu, tell them where to go, what their sector of fire is, and off you go. One of the oddities in this, and this harks back to the need for the game to not necessarily be realistic in order to drive the training. The initial version of this assumed that if you march one of your fire teams out across an open area in front of a machine gun, they're going to get mowed down and dead. And the student reaction was, oh, well, they're gone. The icon has disappeared. Not a big deal. So they changed the model. And if you got that fire team out there, it is pinned down. And it's flashing little lights at you saying, oh no, I'm pinned down, bad things are happening to me. And now it became suddenly this really emotional event for the students that I got to get those guys out of there. How do I save them? How do I rescue them? So by making the model less realistic, they made the model more effective for training. So moving on to indirect. A great example of this is the Artemis Spaceship Bridge Simulator, which is a science fiction game. You get put into what amounts to a Star Trek bridge. You have teams of 4 or 5 people, and you take on the iconic role. So you've got a helm, and you've got weapons, and you've got the engineer, and you've got a captain, you've got a science and communications officer, and so on and so forth. So ostensibly, this has absolutely nothing to do with modern military operations. But we have an instructor who really likes to bring in sets of 16 students, and he breaks them up into 3 ships plus a Commodore. And the genius thing in Artemis is that no one station has the information that it needs. You may be the helm, but you're looking at the world through a soda straw, and when the captain says, go to Starbase 3, you're sitting there saying, where is Starbase 3? I can't see it. So you're going to need either the captain or the science officer to provide you with a bearing on how to get to Starbase 3. The weapons officer can't see everything, doesn't know what the weaknesses of the enemy units are. The science officer can't see the engineering screen, and so on and so forth. So in order to do well, you have to function as a team, passing information back and forth in an efficient manner. You need to figure out what it is that you know that is going to be passed on to whom and when and how do they need to know it. And that, of course, is precisely one of the skills that a staff officer needs. So therefore, the Artemis is the beginning for this instructor of the staff operations block at CGSC, because it's a concrete experience for the whole block, because he can keep on pointing back to Artemis and say, hey, remember when we played Artemis, you needed to do X, Y, Z. You needed a procedure, you needed protocols. Now we're going to do that in terms of a modern staff. We have often used Kriegspiel, the original Prussian 1824 game. It's a great thing for looking at mission command, because in Kriegspiel, you put the students, you put the players in a place where they have very little information. They've got ideally the best time pressure you can put them under, and every order they give has to be issued to another human being. They can't see anybody else's map. They often can barely know where their own units are, and now they have to give an order. And the order has to be understood by the umpire, by another player. And one of the most common reactions to students as they come out of that is, now I understand mission command, or now I miss radios. And third, why aren't we doing this more often? Because it's the best thing we've done all year. We will use Go in some of the classes. So one example of that is that sometimes the East Asian Studies class will look at that because they're wanting to use Go, an East Asian game that occupies much the same cultural position as chess does in the West, of being a venerable game, a good strategy game, which people are used to thinking of as training for strategic thought, and say, all right, you're now understanding a bit of the East Asian mindset better having played the game. We don't really care that they understand Go per se. We want them to understand what they get from it. Equally, we use it in the Games for Training class because it's a great way of explaining the concept of elegance in game design. A tiny number of rules for Go still creates an enormously complex decision space. We really like Quartermaster General as a means of teaching the ends, ways, means construct for understanding strategy. Mike has got a really great slideshow to drive at that. That's not included here, though we could probably get it released pretty easily. And we will often use that with either students or with visiting groups to introduce them to this means of thinking. And part of the reason it works is that Quartermaster General is so simple and so easy to teach that they will get into it, and then they start seeing the strategy, and then they start working through the strategy without having to work too hard on how does this game work. Even I do not consider Hanabi a war game, but Hanabi is a great way of starting to get at the question of critical thinking. So we often use it as an example of, you play the game, and then you start talking about the 8 elements of critical thinking, critical thought from Paul and Elder, and you can see every single one of those 8 actively in use in a game of Hanabi. You discuss that, then you turn around and play it again, and not only will they be playing Hanabi better and they're more likely to succeed, but they will also be more metacognitively aware of the fact that they are engaged in that critical thinking, and that that's part of the reason that they are doing better. So it drives home the use of it. Last but not least in these, and I realize I'm breaking my own promise not to talk about each of these, I apologize for that. Triumph and Tragedy, which is a game that covers the struggle for Europe from 1936 to 1945, is used by Steve Salat, who happens to be the guy in the red shirt in the picture there. He's over helping us with another game, which I believe is Dunkempf. He uses it in his class at Red Team University as an event in which the students are supposed to be using the various ways of seeing and ways of planning. He doesn't care about World War II. He doesn't care about the struggle for Europe. But he does care about, can you harness these various things in a strategic concept? Can you bring these things that we've been talking about that seem like they are sort of abstract, nebulous concepts on how to see things, and now apply them into something that looks a great deal more like warfighting, where you're framing your problem as either the Axis, the Soviets, or West, and then necking that down to how are you utilizing them inside your strategy. All right, so let's drive on before I natter on too long. I promise not to talk about each and every one of these, because otherwise we'll be here all day. Some of these we've talked about already. Many of these we use in either the 681 course or in a series of things that we've been supporting at SAMS in things for various instructors. So we've talked about the Grand Offensive. We've talked about Nevsky. You can see Friedrich being played in Alpha 681 in the picture. One of the other examples in this that's relevant to how we change things. So Napoleon the Waterloo campaign, we came up with, along with the guy who now teaches at the Naval War College, Nick Murray, a extremely cut down version of Napoleon the Waterloo campaign. We basically threw out the entire tactical battle module in favor of something where you roll the dice and you get a result fast in order to concentrate in on the maneuver fight of that campaign. So it's an example of a commercial game that we have fairly significantly modified for our own use. And the slideshow version of the rules for that cut down thing is on Board Game Geek for Napoleon the Waterloo campaign. A quiet confession, by the way, the CRT we put up there is one we replaced in about 2 years ago, and I'm quietly aware of the fact that it means the French can't win, which doesn't much matter when you're playing with students for the first time and the only time, but at some point I will go back to a statistically more competent distribution on the older model that means that everybody has a better chance of winning. Another way that that game was used was there's an instructor, Jim Greer, over at SAMS, who took that for a surprise elective. And because it's double blind, he had it set up the first time so that he and I played as the French in 2 different games against the students who were in pairs as the Prussians and the French. And we played it through once, and we discussed how there was an element of surprise due to the fog of war, and they weren't sure how the thing worked because they couldn't see our forces, and we could surprise them with that. And we discussed that, and then we sat down to play it again. And in the second move of the game, as we played it again, Jim Greer and I both, by prearranged agreement, hauled out a little counter for a hot air balloon. And we plonked it on the map and said, guess what? With the Montgolfier balloon, we now have indirect fire for our artillery park out to 2 areas away. Ready? Here it comes. And launched artillery fire upon the players, which was quite the surprise. And the next turn, as they were recovering from that, again, by prearrangement, we hauled out another balloon marker and said, oh, by the way, with these balloons, we're able to conduct an air assault. And we air assaulted a couple units deep into their rear into one of the key cities. Again, a huge surprise for them. And a turn or two later, once they'd seen the scale of the surprise and they had tried to react to it, and given the devastation we were wreaking, not very successfully, then we broke and we moved to a discussion, which was what Jim Greer wanted. He wanted them to have not only seen, hey, the mere inability to see exactly what the enemy has poses surprises, but there's a real threat of technological and tactical surprise on the battlefield. How do you deal with that? And it was the concrete experience for the rest of the course, which was on how do you deal with technological and tactical surprise. But now they'd experienced it directly. Another example of something that in part was being used indirectly, one of the lessons that we keep on drawing with students out of Thunder in the East is that as they play it, we will pick up 7 of the standard units in it, 7 of the large Army or Corps-sized units. There are Soviet Army's German Corps, which is the same real size because the Soviets ejected the Corps from their organization for most units in the middle of 41. And we point out to them, 3 of those units is the current frontline strength of the US Army. And you add another 3, and you've got all of the Guard and Reserve. And you add another 1, and you've got the entire Marine Corps. And each of you is commanding at least twice that much. And some of you have been tossing units out saying, it's only the one guy. And it's usually a head turn for them on the size of large-scale combat operations. So sometimes the sheer relevance is driving it back to, hey, you were doing this then, but now you're doing this other thing in the game. Lots of good things to talk about here. I'm going to skip forward to Age of Eagles, which is a miniatures game, which when we are playing, we will run it in person with Alpha 681, often as the first class. So it'd be set up when they come in, and it's nice and attractive as a miniatures game, and they fight through it. And we've radically cut it down, and the Napoleonics buffs, like Mike, wind up in tears in the corner because we will cut it down to the point where there's simply infantry, cavalry, and artillery, and the differences between lancers and cuirassiers and so on and so forth are wiped aside because the students are frankly at sea just with the differences between modern and Napoleonic artillery, since they always go in expecting, well, Napoleonic artillery has indirect fire, and you could call for fire of the hill, and you could fire over your own troops instead of through them to get to the enemy. But they will also trip up on things like, well, we're going to march in and we want concentration of force. So we'll put all of our columns of troops close together, march to the front, and then deploy. And they suddenly discover that this means that they do not have the space to deploy, and therefore their time and space is wrong. And the difficulty of projecting where the battlefield's going to be and how you structure your approach march so that you can deploy competently on a Napoleonic battlefield suddenly begins to unfold for them. And one of our favorite episodes in an Alpha 681 class, one of these students burst out, I've been listening to a podcast, an audiobook, sorry, on the Battle of Waterloo all year. And now I understand Napoleonic warfare. It finally falls into place because he's forced to grapple with some of the problems for himself and sees them in action. One of the things we routinely find in these history games is that when you are reading it in the book, you sit there and say, okay, I get it. And I'm trained as a historian. I understand that this is often the way you have to learn. But equally, when you're suddenly forced to deal with it in the game and wrestle with it yourself, it strikes home with the force of revelation. And there are other examples we can bring out, but that's one of the things we're looking for in 681 is for students to experience those moments of revelation of that's how things worked back then, as opposed to the way they worked now, as opposed to the way they worked in a little bit later in a given period. And in the interest of time, I'm going to keep on moving. So for teaching wargaming, these are some of our students in the wargame design track, the master's track this year. That's yet another picture of our lab. And oh, by the way, you can see some of the shelf of wargames we got in the background. So a partial list, starting off absolutely with Frank Chadwick's Battle for Moscow, which we cannot say enough good things about as an introductory wargame. It has rapidly become our absolute favorite introductory wargame. It's reasonably easy to teach. It tends to engage people well. We found that we can get people started from 0 through at least turn 3 when the mud hits in about an hour. It is such that by the end of that point, they wind up grasping the game and sort of seeing what it's supposed to be driving at. If they're faculty that we're indoctrinating, the students are starting to get the idea of what a war game is. And it is simple, but it's not simplistic. It's got a lot of flashes of sophistication that if we are teaching what wargaming is, we can keep on referring back to in later discussions that nonetheless, while they're there, they don't overrun the model and bog the students down too much. So we are really, really impressed with Battle of Moscow, Battle for Moscow. We bought 9 copies physically a couple years ago, and we are running them into the ground. So it's been a great thing that in pretty much the same span of time, we got permission from Frank Chadwick to produce more copies locally for CGSC use as a government thing, and not really simultaneously, but also in the past couple months, C3I magazine has put its issue number 25 out for free as a print and play download. And later in the slideshow, in the reserve slides, I've got a link to C3I magazine so that all of you can get at it. It has been a spectacular success for us. Another game that's worked well in teaching wargaming for us is Battlefield 2. And in many ways, it's a terrible game for teaching, right? If you're teaching squad tactics, there are a lot of downfalls of a game that action-oriented. There's not a lot of realism to it and so on and so forth. But this is the example here. On day 1 of our training with games class, I can bring everybody in and say, all right, we're going to play this game. We're going to be playing it inside of 15 minutes. You're going to understand it inside of the first round. Inside of 45 minutes, we will have played it 3 times with all of you against the AI. So all of them against the AI for once serves as an icebreaker for all the students. Helps them get to know each other a little bit, creates a nice positive buzz for the class. 2, we try to structure it so that the first time through they're going to lose. The second time through, ideally, they lose by a little bit, and the third time through they win. And in between each of these, we're discussing, well, why did you lose? And they'll say, well, we didn't have any coordination, we didn't have any planning, we didn't know what we're doing. And we appoint somebody who's been particularly vocal about this to be the commander, and they work through, and off we go. The it works extraordinarily well for us in that spot, and it drives a solid hour's worth of discussion on, hey, how could you use either this or something of its type to teach squad level tactics? And equally importantly, it gets them used to the notion that it's perfectly valid in our class to be bringing up the weaknesses of the tool, because there are things Battlefield 2 does pretty poorly for squad training. For all that, it is fun and easy to use. And with some controls, you can make it work. Wings of War, another piece of indirect use in training. This is an idea Mike Dunn came up with. We put out Wings of War, and it's sitting there on the table, and everybody likes the miniatures, and they look cool. And Mike hands them their secret briefing as either an Allied or a German commander, and he is carefully, quietly asked around as the students are coming in, hey, is anybody a pilot? And oddly enough, all of them wind up on one side. And then they're told at the end of their secret briefing, which has a lot of flowery language and description of who you are in it, there's a number, and you're told to remember this number, 1, 2, or 3. And whenever you shoot the enemy, you have to mention the number, and Mike is drawing a card off the deck for damage based on that number. And pretty soon, either somebody gets shot down, or somebody says, this thing is completely rigged, or both. And we say, well, yes, you're completely correct. It is rigged. How is it rigged? And they say, well, it's unfair. My airplane always misses. Your airplane always hits. And we say, okay, so remember back to your briefing. Who were you? Well, I'm a new pilot who's on his first combat flight ever. Oh, okay. And hey, your opponent there was shredding you. What was your briefing? Well, I'm this cat called Manfred von Richthofen. We say, yeah, you're the Red Baron. Oh. So we then ask them, does it make sense that the rookie pilot is missing and the Red Baron is shredding you? Yes. So as Mike noted in chat there, he has literally stacked the deck in favor of the Germans. But the point of this is we then go into what are the kinds of models here? What is a model? What are the kinds of models? Which ones are stochastic? Which ones are deterministic? How is it that you can shape your models in order to get at the things you care about? And how would you change some of these models if you had a different learning point in mind? So over the course of about an hour in the class, we've both entertained them, engaged them, and given them a lesson in the various factors of the basics of models and sims that they're not likely to forget anytime soon. We've talked about Go. TAC Ops is a great, though sadly elderly, game at this point on tactical maneuver, army tactical maneuver with typically platoon-sized elements that we will still use in part because of its simplicity. So we will drop people into it and people will complain, well, you know, the maps are terrible. They've only got high elevation and low elevation, this, that, and the other. And we then use that as a springboard for a discussion of what do you care about? Do you need super detailed terrain? What learning objectives would you want detailed terrain for, and what objectives would you not? If you care about a particular piece of dirt, you really need to simulate, say, the National Training Center or Fort Polk or wherever it might be, yeah, TAC Ops might not be the right place to, or the right sim to do it. On the other hand, by the very fact that you've simplified the terrain, it means that you don't get into the business that you often do with complex terrain of fighting over how do we manage to figure out the spaghetti on the map and how do we make use of it. So you play LOS tool half the game and the person who plays LOS tool gets a decisive advantage. By using simplified terrain, you're now down to the basic blocking and checking of tactics. Hey, I've got a forward slope, I've got a reverse slope, which one should I use? Well, here are the advantages and disadvantages, but it's hard to screw up the placement of your units once you've made that choice. So sometimes that simplification allows you to put a given concept in stark relief. And there's many others. One of the key things for the Wargaming Masters track in particular is having an extraordinarily deep bench for critical play. So just the same way as in a filmmaking program or music program, you will sit there and you will watch movies or listen to music, but it's not so that you can bliss out and eat your popcorn or whatever. You're sitting there saying, hey, how did they make that shot? How did they structure this film to get at what they wanted to do? How did making the shot in this end to that end manage to be get the impact that they wanted? And in the same way, we want them to play a lot of games with that critical mindset. Why does this game achieve the impact that it does? What structures inside it get at the things that we want you to get at? And one of the wonderful things about the MMAS program is, since they come in typically this next year to be a bit different because unfortunately COVID is running the schedule around on us, they come in August. we can run them through really the basic fundamentals of war games in August in a series of lightning classes. And then we got about a month and a half to 2 months of critical play in which we already know what their topics are. And so Mike and I will go through a lot of work actually to say, all right, this person needs this and that person needs that, but they've got some mechanical overlap here. So we're going to have them play this game on this day and so on and so forth, and run them through things with things that we know we want them to pick out. And there will inevitably other things that they pick out, and we work through them. Strike of the Eagle, which I skipped earlier, is one of the most common games to put in there, simply because it's got a lot of really cool mechanics in one game, ranging from the way it uses the cards to it's the thing where they run into the Columbia blocks concept and so on and so forth. So it's a very commonly used game for that for us. And for what it's worth, earlier today, we were using Strike of the Eagle in Alpha 681. We're finding that students doing design makes them learn an enormous amount. Even the elective version of the design class, which means we've got 6 two-hour classes that meet 3 times a week over the course of about 4 weeks. It's done at a dead run. Is something that the students always report that they've learned a great deal from. And in that, not only have they designed their own thing, sometimes with some really shockingly, wonderfully clever ideas, of which my favorite that I always trot out is somebody a couple years ago did the Battle of Zama, so Rome versus Carthage 2,000 some years ago. And he stole a bunch of Duplo blocks from his kids, these big Lego blocks. And different colors of Lego blocks were different kinds of units. And you stuck them together to make a formation, and you put clear plastic tape on them so that you could make a dry erase marker mark for the order for the formation. And every turn, you got to change one order for one formation. And there are ways at which the game didn't work right by the end of the time because he'd only had 2 rounds of testing for it. Oh, you're barely getting to the draft prototype stage. His big problem was that the model for the Carthaginian elephants was either they got scared off by the Roman horns, stampeded in the Carthaginian lines, and the Romans won, or the Roman horns failed and the elephants stomped the Romans. So he needed a lot of model work. But he understood that and he was trying. But it was a cool idea nonetheless. And one of the things we're happy about letting them experiment with their topics is that we get sometimes some really neat ideas like that coming out of it. Equally though, and this really took us by surprise the first time we ran it, we had not understood just how much the students would learn by testing each other's games. That is easily half the learning they get is sitting down and doing that critical analysis and feedback to one of their peers on the design they've seen there. And it is often the case that somebody will walk in and they will be convinced that this first of their draft of their game is utter genius, and then it's terrible and it turns out to be unplayable, and they redesign it, and then they redesign a newer version and bring it in, and that one doesn't entirely work, and so on and so forth. And it keeps rolling forward, but there's an enormous amount of learning there. Last but not least, I should mention the Brown Bag Gaming Program, which is a largely optional. I say largely because the MMAS students, the master's students, are told they have to attend 3/4 of them over the course of the year because it's an addition to their directed play program of running games typically on Friday afternoons, theoretically for fun. But it has other objectives than fun. One, we believe that this is a form of individual professional development. That the sheer fact of engaging in practicing tactics, operations, strategy, logistics, whatever it might be in one of these games is a professional development activity for these students as useful as any of the others that they're going to do. For those who are in the simulations field, then it is even more directly a professional development activity. They're seeing options that they could use. When we are looking at the faculty who come to these, we are hoping that either they will decide that something that we've run would be useful for them, or potentially that they will decide that there's something similar that might be used, or we will get a discussion with them that will cause things to spread. This also serves to help build our mailing list for the Brown Bag program, which includes both students, faculty, former students, anybody who wants to join. It is open to all, in which we can thereby build the depth in our resources. So for example, we could send out the Brown Bag list, does anybody know about a game on X? Or we can mention an event and people will be able to help. The Brown Bag events during COVID have been online, so everybody has been able to join in. And I've also, over the past year or so, been putting out a loosely weekly Models and Sims news notes newsletter of things that one way or another struck me as interesting, somehow related to models, simulations, gaming. It sometimes is slightly indirect. So back when AlphaGo was beating up on the best Go players in the world, I was putting out a number of articles on the AI as they came out, and good. And you can see in here sort of the range of things that we show. We will try over the course, the Thunder in the East down there, that is lunchtime during winter break. During the breaks, we will try and run longer form games for people because it means we can run something that is bigger than will fit in the typical 3-hour time slot. Another example of professional development. So how about Warhammer 40K, whose direct obvious relevance to modern wargaming is approximately 0. However, Captain Andrew Powell, known as Red, who is shown there in the picture, he's one of my students in the master's program this year. He's going to be defending his MMAS this Friday. In fact, wish him luck. And he is the captain of the U.S. Army's official esports Warhammer 40K team. He's one of the best players for Warhammer 40K in the world. He apparently won the tournament this year in his faction. I'm not enough of a Warhammer 40K guy to know what it was. I think it was Khorne, one of the orc factions, could be wrong. But he's done very well. And no surprise, he is also doing pretty well at CGSC. And we have noticed that when you face him across the gaming table, you'd better pack a lunch, because he is good at the business of analyzing the situation, figuring out what it is might need to be done, adjusting it on the fly to keep things coherent, and welding all of his capabilities into an effective force that aims at his objective, which is a terrible lesson for a military officer to learn. I can't see any relevance in that, of course, other than all of it. So that is why we would argue that as a form of professional development, playing war games is a great thing almost regardless of what war game you play. I'm going to hesitate to claim that any war game will do it, although I would like to claim that any war game has some value. Obviously, the ones that are going to present you with more difficult, more in-depth dilemmas are probably better. On the other hand, there's also issues of time and learning the game to consider. You know, people have other lives, except those of us who are gamers, you know, like me, who would therefore consider it to be an excellent use of my spare time. So you guys had asked earlier about manual versus computer wargaming. You can see our lab and see that we've got computers around the edge, and then we've got the manual games in the middle, with a very deliberate set of advertising of some of the manual games on top of the computers. As far as I'm concerned, both of them have value, and the strength of one is generally the weakness of the other. So for example, the computers do all the math, which frankly is awesome. The computers make it easy to do fog of war. The computers will track all sorts of details for you. And that's great. That's a load off of your hands as the person running the game or the person playing the game. However, there is a flip side to that. We notice that often when students are playing it on the computer and they are not forced to understand the model, they don't learn the model, and instead they treat it as a black box. I shove this icon forward, and if I'm lucky, it goes well, and I'm a genius. And if it goes bad, well, the computers screw me, and it does not work. So the computer saves you effort, but on the flip side, in some cases, by saving you the effort, you don't wind up understanding the reason that something occurred, and therefore you don't learn the lesson. So the flip side, of course, is it can be hard to learn how to operate the manual game. There's more mental effort. There's more lifting that somebody has to do to make it work. And it is true that with the computer game, if you get engaged in it, you will learn a great deal about how it operates under the hood, assuming that the designer has told you this, in order to be able to be better. But not everybody engages to that depth with the game that's in front of them. Another standard example that we will trot out is that on a manual game, you can have a fairly large map, but there is a limit. At some point, you can't reach the board out into the middle, and that's kind of the limit of the useful size of the game map, unless you put it on the floor and you're careful not to step on stuff and so on and so forth. On the other hand, it's very easy for me with the Mark I eyeball to look at the entire map or just a part of the map, to zoom in and out. I can lean around. The interface is perfectly intuitive because it's the body I've been wearing for the past however many decades. On the other hand, the computer can have a map that is any size you like within the restraints of RAM. It's easy to do. You just shove more stuff in there. The problem is, compared to a large table, I have to view it through the soda straw of a monitor. And the interface for using it is something I've got to learn. Even if it's something relatively standard, like right click to drag and zoom the mouse wheel in and out, at some point somebody's got to learn that, and we cannot assume that our students come in knowing that. It is possible. Now, I'm a fan of VR. I've got a system at home. It's lots of fun. It's not there yet, but I think it may be coming to the point where a VR system will allow us to get the best of both worlds, where the computer can give me a map of any size, and a better interface and crisper resolution will allow me to see things as clearly as I do with my own eyes, and to use the Mark I hand as the intuitive interface. Not there yet. Hey, 5 years from now, could be common. I don't know. So this is not a I love computers or I hate computers. It's not a I love board games, hate board games. I think all of them are options, and all of them have their strengths and weaknesses. A few tips and tricks. Teaching with games is a skill. Don't underestimate this. Just as giving a lecture is a skill, just as running a discussion is a skill. It takes practice, it takes time, and it takes effort. And if you assume that the game is going to be the trainer for everybody, and you can sort of sit back and let it be the teacher, then you're wrong. It's not going to happen. Some people will be their own teacher with the game, but not everyone will, and it's unprofessional to assume that that's going to be the case. You have to be ready to sit in and see what's going on and be prepared to pull out lessons and spark discussion and note what you want to bring out of the experience. It can be helpful in that regard for there to be a split between who's facilitating the game and making it run and who is the instructor and worried about how the discussion is going to go later. Because the instructor can be saying, this thing happened, that thing happened, and saving it for later. One of the experiences that drove me home for me a number of years ago, Mike Dunn and I were out assisting Matrix games at the Army War College. And so these are essentially role-playing games about a given strategic situation. And the instructors for the class sat in the back of the room in front of computers, and it looked like they were checking their email most of the time. And I was a little bit peeved at them as this went on through the day, because it seemed like they were completely checked out. They had no clue what was going on. They were letting me babysit for them, and then they walk out, was the impression I was getting. And I was completely wrong. Because what happened when we hit time for the game and it ended, they suddenly stood up, took over the classroom, and they had really insightful, focused observations on things the teams had been doing. You did this, which prompted them to do that, and why did you do this thing? Did you expect that outcome? Did you expect this? What was your reasoning? And it dawned on me that they weren't checked out. They were paying very, very close attention the whole time. They were taking good notes, and drove home that this split can be useful. It's also often useful simply for us, because when the instructor says, hey, I want game X, as often as not, that instructor is not a gamer. They don't really grok the games, and it's a bridge too far for them to learn how to run the game and learn to run it in the class. So we will provide the personnel to teach and moderate, facilitate the game, and they can worry about how it fits into the instruction. When the game gets widespread enough, that does not happen, but often by that point, we've also had enough practice with it in the smaller runs that we can figure out how the trainer is going to work and make it work successfully. Preparation is critical. Mike and I will murder board each other on the teaching script. We will often do that multiple times before the first read. We've already told you that we will run through multiple AARs after. And it's intentionally brutal because we want to point out all the flaws. Hey, James, you said this and it was not clear. You skipped this topic. These 3 topics were out of order. You need to rearrange them. And that way we get better. You need to be flexible as you're running them. Simulations, games are chaos engines. If you want to have an exact sequence of events unfold in exactly the order that you planned, you don't want a game, because you don't want student decisions and possibly random numbers screwing up your perfect sequence. What you want is a film clip. But if you want that opportunity for decisions to have outcomes in a competitive environment, now you need the war game. And in accepting that, you accept the possibility that things that you wanted to happen won't. In larger exercises, larger student groups, you can sometimes tap things back the way you want, either by an instructor override, a white cell override, or by various forms of injects. and make sure that various things, specific events you want will occur. But you may have to accept that no matter what you do, if you're trying to steer the students left, sometimes the students just intend to go right, and it's what they're going to do. And you might have to roll with it. It will take practice to make it run in the classroom. You're going to want to run things several times. I know that we've moved 681, the history through wargaming class, online for this iteration. And we began with, let's see, we went home in late March, and we pretty rapidly started into a intensive series of experiments with various online systems to figure out what we were going to use, which games we could use, which ones were going to work, which ones weren't going to work, how we make them work. And in addition, we've had multiple train-up sessions, both internally, and the final one is always optional with the students. And that's on the afternoon before we finally run the game, so to speak, in production with the students, because we're trying to iron out as many of the tech difficulties or the difficulties in our understanding as we can before we actually run it. We talked about don't let anybody win. Last point, and we touched on this before, the payoff for the game may be delayed. You may not see it on the day itself. You may see it weeks or months later. I'm going to steal a war story from Jim Lacey, who uses games extensively in his teaching at the Marine Corps War College. He has a great article out there about how he wrote the best lecture ever on Thucydides, and it was, of course, wonderful. And as he admits, all the students had forgotten it within 15 minutes, and they had no idea what it was about. And then he started running them through a game called Polis on the Peloponnesian War. And he would ask them at the end, so why did the Athenians go to Sicily? Is this a bad idea, or is it a good idea poorly executed? And they all look at him and say, well, you have to secure the grain supplies. And the bigger payoff was 6 months later, as he tells this story, he is accosted in the hallway by the commandant of the college, who wants to know how these things are running. And one of these students happens to be walking down the hallway. So Jim Lacey grabs the student and says, what do you remember about the Peloponnesian War? And the student launches into this 15-minute discussion of why it is you have to secure the grain supplies and what it is that you need to do to go to Sicily or other ways you could secure them, and the strategic situation, on and on and on. Do they remember what's going on in that war? You better believe it, because they had to experience it and they had to wrestle with it themselves, and they can still draw the parallels back to the modern day and what it means for them. So with that, there are reserved slides we can drive to if we need, but I think we are now on to questions, and hopefully not too late.
Perfect. Well, thank you again, James. We've got a nice list of questions here we can get started with. First, what are your thoughts regarding each service developing a wargaming unit within their organizations that standardizes wargaming training and education?
There's both goodness and badness to that. So the worry I have is, in some ways, standardization is awesome, right? Because standardization ensures that there's some place for the people who don't know what they're doing to go and get a starter. The thing I worry about in standardization is that courses, in particular, training and education situations, are often not a uniform standard product. And we have different needs in different places at different points in instruction. So the downfall of standardization is that sometimes you get a bureaucrat in charge of it who says, we have standardized upon this one tool and it will be used across all times and places for all things. Everything you need. It just can't be done. And if we do standardization, then I would like to ensure that, or insist that the group doing the standardization is open to lots of local experimentation. That what it's providing is not a you must do this, but a here is how we can help you start. Please tell us about your best practices and your new discoveries. There is a layer at which I work at one of those shops. We are supposed to be a wargame support unit across Army University. So people from across Army University come to us for help. We, in fact, get calls for help across the Army. Mike Dunn was sent off to the California National Guard late last year in order to help them understand wargaming better, for example. And I think that's a great thing. There is a shop at the Naval War College that does much the same thing. There's a shop at the Army War College that does much the same thing. There's a shop at the National Defense University that does much the same thing. There's a shop at the Marine Corps University that does much the same thing. And we're all in contact, which is a good thing. We've also got contact with people at Air Force University who, again, do many of these things. And there's a layer at which, personally, I think having the shops supporting it and then the cross coordination is probably better than one monolithic DoD organization that can say, this is the one tool you're going to use. There's also, in the Army, there's the Army Model and Simulations Office, whom we work with fairly often. And we work with them all the time, frankly. There's people up at the National Simulation Center whom we also keep in touch with on a regular basis. So I guess my preferred solution would be often coordination and communication is better than any monolithic solution. Next.
Yeah, so the next question is, what are your thoughts on wargaming options as some of our historically residential military courses move to a distributed online learning platform, and options for that beyond Zoom, Blackboard, etc.?
So the experimentation we've done, we found that there were a couple obvious solutions that we tried. And we have had different experiences with those than some, and I'll sort of address some of that. So the three things we really looked at were Vassal, which is the virtual advanced squad leader something or other, and Tabletopia and Tabletop Simulator. And the surprise upset of this, because Mike and I both had fairly negative memories of Vassal from the 1990s, was we found that Vassal was our choice. It had the widest range of things that we wanted in a package that we found was technically easy to use and was technically relatively easy to install, and it has worked. Tabletopia is really slick. It's a beautiful interface, but to our great surprise, because we were trying to use Race to the Rhine there, it's where it's available, and Race to the Rhine is a great logistics-centered wargame. Tabletopia caused us enormous numbers of technical problems when we used it with students. Now, some of that is student equipment is varied. We are enthusiasts, so generally we come home and we have fairly powerful computers. At least one of our students was using a laptop that he had bought as a burner somewhere back around 2008 to take to Afghanistan. In dog years, it was over a century old, and it couldn't handle Tabletopia at all. It simply died. We found that some of the interface things in Tabletopia, because it provides a bit of 3D simulation and physics simulation, kept on tripping people up. If we'd used it more than once, many of those things might have gone away. We might have figured them out. But nonetheless, it was a much more significant training and learning curve than we had expected, particularly particularly compared to Vassal on its very first outing with those same students. The thing we really bounced off of that was a surprise to us was Tabletop Simulator. Maybe it's the modules we looked at, but the modules we wound up looking at all seemed to be somewhat half-baked. The 3D simulation kept on just getting in the way and tripping things up, and it made it difficult to set up. Plus, we are reflexively opposed to making students buy things that they will use once. So we wound up going with Vassal because it is free. It also turned out to be much easier for some of our guys to be making modules in Vassal or modifying some of the Vassal modules that are out there. And it was easier for them to do than in Tabletop Simulator or in Tabletopia. The dark horse candidate in all this is a Army joint product out of OSD Cape called Swift. I forget exactly what it stands for, that is a Vassal-like capability, but it requires actual real programming in order to make the module. Unlike Vassal, it can enforce the rules, but unlike Vassal, you have to be program aware, you have to understand the look of code, but you don't have to be a coder to do Vassal. You really have to be a coder to make a module in Swift. And Swift is something that we have intended to and largely failed to engage to the degree that it really deserves over the past couple of years. So Vassal has wound up being our tool of choice, somewhat to our surprise. For comms, I saw a few things going by in the chat about comms. We have wound up using Blackboard Collaborate because it is the tool that we have available. It is not perfect. When it works well, it works decently. When it works poorly, it is terrible, like any other tool. We are toying with the notion of going to something that is more flexible. The problem we've run into is Blackboard is great when you've got everybody in one room, or one way or another, you can put people in breakout rooms in it when everybody is still in one room. But when you want to have multiple people on one team and then have them have a secret chat, it does not deal with that very well, which is why we're starting to think about possibly something like Discord. We haven't gone there. We don't know that we'll go there. Discord is its own separate learning curve. So we have yet to piece that out. Does that answer the question, or did I drift off of it?
No, that was great.
All right.
So next question, in your opinion, what are some of the best war games for maritime warfare, specifically at the operational level?
I am not a naval guy, so I'm going to put that caveat out front, and then I'm going to give you some ideas. So to my mind, and the naval people in here, I know Chris Weave is out in the audience, Stephen Downs Martin is out in the audience. Feel free to correct me at some point and set me straight. To my mind, the operational realm of the naval runs somewhere between, hey, this is tactical, my ship is shooting your ship or shooting your airplane or whatever. We're not worried about that when we get outside the tactical realm. We want a system out. And yeah, Mike, we're going to 1805 in a minute. And it's not at the national strategy level of what is the goal and how are we going to get there? How are we structuring the force? So a great example, as Mike brought up, is 1805 Sea of Glory for a truly operational level naval look at the Napoleonic Wars. It really hand waves how the combat occurs. Your current objectives are handed down by a random system from Napoleon and William Pitt. But inside that, you've got to figure out how to handle the naval forces you've got in order to achieve those objectives. And it winds up being really pretty neat. We've really liked it. We had the great good fortune once to run a game of that, and the British side was commanded by a US naval officer, I've forgotten his name. He was a Napoleonic naval nut, and he would interrupt the game for 5 to 10 minutes at a time in order to explain to us exactly why the game was right, which was pretty neat since he really knew his stuff. He proceeded to win the game in a battle off Cape Trafalgar in which he annihilated the combined French and Spanish fleets and had his admiral killed, but it was Collingwood, not Nelson. So he almost completely recreated Trafalgar, not through any setup on our own. Another one that comes to mind as a operational level naval game is PQ-17 from GMT on the North Atlantic convoys. Some people have mentioned the fleet system, which to my shame, I have never played. But I'm going to stop holding forth on those for now. Actually, seeing one thing, the reason I would call the Harpoon and the CMOs not an operational game is their fundamental loop is, does my missile hit? And you need to control that to get your best results. So to my mind, those are really fundamentally tactical, although you can, with enough horsepower, make them tactical writ very large. Sorry, next question. I will shut up for a minute.
No worries. So next question. Based on the RAND study of the next generation's wargaming for the U.S. Marine Corps in 2019, what are your thoughts regarding wargaming being used not only as a training or education tool, but also to support concept and technological development?
So it can be a great tool. The trick is you have to use it carefully. And you have to use it carefully first by understanding that a war game is not a predictor. A war game is a means of exploration. It doesn't tell you this will happen. It tells you that this could, with some bounds on probability and plausibility, happen. And you have to remember that you are exploring a possible future and not the future. Second, as soon as you move into the realm of analytics and prediction, exploration, which is what you're doing there, you need to be a lot more careful about, hey, how does this model potentially predetermine or overdetermine the outcome? So it's certainly possible, and in bad cases, this is a pitfall of wargaming, you can set up a wargame that is guaranteed to show you a given outcome, whether you intended it or not. You may not realize that the model is going to produce this outcome, but it's really set up to do that. On the other hand, if you were aware of the ways that the model works and therefore the limitations of the model, all models are wrong, then you can keep the model being useful because you can understand what it is you're exploring within those limitations. So there's definitely value. There is a reason that wargaming is a step in the military decision-making process. It's because that exploration of the future is key, not because it shows you this will happen, but even with a hastily conducted low-fidelity wargame, it makes you start thinking about these are parts of the things that might happen. How would we handle it if this thing comes about? What are we going to do if the enemy does that? How are we going to react? What plans do we need to have in place? And that exploration is incredibly valuable when you're careful with it.
All right, so Jane, if you're all right with it, I think we could maybe squeeze in 2 more questions or so.
Okay.
So next, based on the earlier story of the game that went home, I believe the Somme game, about folks going home, playing that game against one another, what is the better learning tool? Head-to-head in groups, or single player versus an AI, but scoring against others, such as in the Somme example?
Yes. Because inevitably, the answer there is it depends. What are you trying to get at? What's the time constraint? How many students do you have? The reason that the Somme game works is that it's simple enough. The proper name for the Somme game is the Grand Offensive, is that it's simple enough that they can take it home and run it by themselves and then come back in and compare their scores and drive on. On the other hand, there is a great deal to be said for the energy of competition of, hey, I'm going to nail you, or we in this room, we're going up against those guys in the other room. Both of these have value. The question is, what are you trying to get at? How much time do you have? How simple or complex does the game need to be? Because often if it's a more complex game, you're going to need to be doing it in the classroom anyway, so that you can either have a trained student helping run the game or one of us helping run the game. So I realize that's sort of a yes or no answer, but you have to go back to the specifics of what's the learning objective and the constraints on the situation you're putting it in, or you're shooting in the dark.
All right, so before we get to our final question, there's a couple procedural ones. So first is we have someone asking if your course outline for history through wargames is available.
The course outline for history for wargames should be available, but I'm not sure we've got it rewritten for the current version. And there was some flailing around earlier when we realized that last year's syllabus had disappeared, so it had to be rebuilt. But yes, it should be available, and we should be able to put that out. There'll be a few wickets to check, just to double check on that, but should be feasible.
Perfect. And so for our final question, going back to the discussion earlier that you touched on about that computer-based versus tabletop wargaming, how do you, within that context, how do you instill that the student is the tool? I know you talked about a little bit around this during your earlier discussion, but this notion that I think, from the person asking the question, that the idea that the student is the tool versus getting tied up in the mechanics of these games.
So in a sense, it's not that the student is the tool, it's that the student is the focus. What we care about is that the student is learning, and everything else has to be aimed at that objective. So if the student doesn't need to know how the game works in order to get to the thing they're supposed to learn, then they don't need to know how the game works, and we don't care. If, on the other hand, and sometimes that is valuable. Sometimes, so for the big staff exercises, it's often useful for us to be able to have the bulk of the staff, the student staff, not aware of how the game works, not aware of the ins and outs of it, because what we want them doing is thinking in terms of real world products and real world decisions. So if they follow their real world norms and they make the decision on the basis of that, all is well. And we may therefore come and rejig what's happening as it occurs in order to make sure that the expected outcome occurs for them, because if they've done the right things, then we want to reinforce it by giving them, so to speak, the right outcome most of the time. The flip side of that is sometimes understanding the model is how they're going to get at the learning. So 681 is an example of that. I want them to engage with the model in 681 and the learning through history, because the model is part of how they are seeing what's different about this period of history. I want them to have to fight with the question of how do we get to provide artillery support in this era as opposed to whatever they're used to in the modern era. And you've got to make this decision on a case-by-case basis based on what it is you want them to learn, how you expect them to learn it, how the game fits into the learning. I know this is the last question. I'm going to go into briefly so that people know they're there two of these reserved slides because some of the things that have flashed back kind of get at them. First, these are things that we, in the various courses, assign as reading. If you're in the master's course, you will be told to read all of these. Some of these are pretty obvious why they're there. Some of them are a little less obvious. Koster's book, Theory of Fun, is a great introduction to why it is that games are fun. And the argument he's making, which is why we assign it, is games are fun because they tickle the same reward system in your brain as learning. We enjoy games because we learn. We get bored with games because we don't think we have anything more to learn from them, or it's no longer worth the effort. Some games, admittedly, people are different. Some games people will think they're learning from and they're being engrossed in for their lives. Something like chess or Go can be a lifetime occupation for some people. Tic-tac-toe is a lifetime occupation for basically nobody because you learn how to solve it. Perla's Art of Wargaming, Saban's Simulating War, and Caffrey's on Wargaming, all are there for obvious reasons. My Wargame master students have told me that Peter Perla is Clausewitz and Phil Saban is Jomini. Peter Perla was very entertained to hear that when I told it to him one year. The UK Wargaming Handbook is a wonderfully concise look and complete look at wargaming, which is why we make the unusual step of handing out something that is foreign. Call 20-6 is a much more US-centric look, and it's more focused on, hey, how can you use it in your unit? And Chris Weave's Wargame Pathologies is looking at all the ways that wargames can go wrong, particularly for analytic wargaming. And it's a great, I hesitate to call it a dash of cold water, but it's a great warning on the things that could fail in your game and therefore things that you want to avoid having happen. There's a few other references that one way or another's that we have talked about. We use the Modern Warfare 3 video from The Onion every year in many of the classes in order to drive the awareness that we don't actually want perfect realism in the game. As a means of helping to learn to teach games, the guy at Watch It Played does a great idea. I know there are others. This is not a uniquely, he's the best ever. Another thing to do, I know it was my boot camp, is get on a demo team for a game, any game, and go and teach it at a convention for 5 days, 16 hours a day, and you will learn how to teach a game. C3I magazine has got Battle for Moscow available for download for free, and our variant of Napoleon and the Waterloo campaign is at that link. Those are just model references and two great quotes from George Box. This is the one that's really well known. And last but not least, I also like to remind students of the last line of this. Over elaboration and over parameterization is often the mark of mediocrity. Often a simple, elegant design as opposed to a simplistic design is really the true pinnacle of success. It's focused on what you do and it does the thing you really want it to do. So pending any other questions from Robert, then thank you for coming. And I've come to the end of my remarks.
Well, thank you again, James, for an incredibly informative discussion this evening. I found this personally really enjoyable, and it seems that we had a great discussion and it stimulated plenty of great questions. I would just add before we log off tonight that our next event will be on June 2nd, where our president, Caitlin Long, and Nicholas Rice will be featuring their war game that they created for Professor Sebastian Bay's Basics of Wargaming class at Georgetown Security Studies program. The information for that event and future events can be found on our website. I just put the link in the chat if you still need that information. Other than that, again, thank you, James, for the presentation tonight, and thank you to everybody that attended and the contribution to the discussion that you provided. With that, James, if you have anything else to add?
Play more games. And I'm perfectly serious about this. If you are in the wargaming field, playing games is a professional development activity that you should be engaged in on a regular basis. Playing them, thinking about them. I realize that the specific thing you're playing may not be useful in class, but you are mining for examples of how models and sims work together to create an outcome. And those you can use somewhere else.